The crime, which will be discussed in this video, simply had to remain unsolved. It would have been so in fact, if not for the wild idiotic act of one of its participants. The story begins on January 23, 2004 in the suburbs of Los Angeles, in the small town of Pico Rivera. The day went pretty smoothly for Sergeant Kevin Lloyd. He was engaged in simple patrol of the streets until he received information about the murder. He was closest to the crime scene and therefore arrived there first. The crime scene was a parking lot outside a liquor store. It was already evening. The crime scene was illuminated only by the garlands that had remained there from the Christmas holidays and the lantern located across the road. The victim was 23-year-old John Juarez, who died from a bullet in the head. Before his death, John was in a telephone booth, where he talked to his wife on the phone. On the phone, the wife heard that someone was asking her husband where he was from, to which he replied that it was none of your business, after which he received a bullet in the head. One of the people in the store confirmed that John was actually approached by a young Hispanic man. Then a shot rang out, and the gunman immediately got into the car and fled the scene of the crime. No one remembers the numbers of cars. It was clear that there were two criminals, the one who shot and the driver of the car. By and large, there were not so many leads in the case. John Juarez was an ordinary bus driver, had a wife and a 3-year-old daughter. Nothing indicated that the crime had anything to do with his acquaintances. It was more like a failed robbery by local hooligans. However, it was almost impossible to find them. Over time, the police officer who arrived first at the crime scene, Sergeant Kevin Lloyd, rose to the rank of lieutenant and became a detective. In 2008, 4 years after the liquor store crime, Kevin Lloyd was investigating a small robbery. He sat in his office and looked at photographs of criminals. Suddenly seeing a photo of one of the perpetrators, a clear picture of the 4-year-old crime arose in Lloyd's mind. Liquor store, lights on, male across the street. A photograph of one of the criminals sharply inspired long-forgotten images. In front of Lloyd was a photograph of a man named Anthony Garcia. There was nothing serious about him in the database. Once he was arrested driving a car without a license. Due to suspicions that he was a member of the local gang, Rivera 13, his photo was entered into the police database. As already mentioned, the photograph of Anthony Garcia raised a lot of questions from Detective Lloyd. On the same day, he got back into the car and returned to the scene of the crime 4 years ago, to the liquor store. Having been there, he only convinced himself even more that Anthony Garcia is the man who knows a lot about the murder of John Juarez. Anthony Garcia was arrested the next day. Probably, many of you are worried about the question of how Detective Lloyd, just by looking at the photo of Garcia, realized that he was involved in the murder of Juarez. The fact is that on the body of Garcia there was a tattoo that completely repeats the crime of 4 years ago. On his chest he had a tattoo of the same liquor store with garlands on the roof, next to the store the same lamppost, the same poster with the inscription Rivera. And on the neck was the inscription Rivera kills. It was these tattoos that aroused Detective Lloyd's suspicions. Garcia likely mistook Juarez for a member of another gang and killed him during the shootout. Although Juarez was an ordinary bus driver, one tattoo was not enough to bring the guy to court. To obtain more weighty evidence in the case, the following was done. As was said, Garcia was arrested due to shoplifting. Garcia spent a couple of days at the police station. There, along with him, another person was put in the same cell, presumably a member of the Rivera 13 gang. It was actually an undercover cop with a recording device. The policeman managed to get Garcia to talk, and he began to brag about the murder of John Juarez. This already guaranteed a 100% guilty verdict. But that's not all. Police managed to find a second person, the driver of the car in which Garcia fled the scene. He was also a member of the Rivera 13 gang. At the trial, he testified against Anthony Garcia, which left no chance for an acquittal. The victim's wife also spoke at the trial. She said, "Thank you for that stupid tattoo, without it you would never have been caught." As a result, Anthony Garcia received 65 years in prison. And the driver of the car was given 25 years.